He was the dark horse candidate who became Pope. Cardinal Robert Prevost is now Pope Leo XIV. On this week's show, we take you behind the scenes of the conclave that elected the first American Pope with a Vatican expert. And the Conclave Crew explains what this Pope could do next. Come on. I'm Raymond Arroyo. Welcome to Arroyo Grande. Go subscribe and turn those notifications on. I don't want you to miss an episode or any of the specials we have coming. We've got a lot coming your way. The world was stunned when the first American Pope, Leo XIV, appeared on the loggia at St. Peter's. He was not among the top candidates going into the conclave. For the moments that may have led to his election, I'm joined now by Vaticanista, co-author of the College of Cardinals reports, and really one of the best Vatican journalists in the city, Diane Montagna. Diane, thank you so much for being here. Tell me about the state of this College of Cardinals before they went into the conclave. What were their biggest concerns? What were they telling you?
Well, I think that one of the biggest concerns actually was that they didn't know one another. So, the viewers should keep in mind that Pope Francis had appointed most of the cardinals in his 12-year pontificate. He appointed them from countries all over the world, not the traditional sees like perhaps Milan or Los Angeles, but from many unknown places. So really going in, you had many cardinals who had recently been appointed. This was their first conclave, and they didn't really know one another.
Tell me about the progressive and traditional cardinal candidates going in.
Yes.
Lay out who the main candidates were of each bloc. I hate the word conservative and liberal. They're progressives and they're traditional. They all basically believe the same thing. It's just really tonality and what they mean to do within the church.
Yes. Well, clearly going in, I would say that the leading progressive candidate was probably the former Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Pietro Parolin. And he, in fact, because the Dean of the College of Cardinals, Cardinal Ray, I believe he's over 90 years old, so he couldn't actually enter the conclave. So you had Cardinal Parolin going in as not only the leading candidate for the left, but also as running the conclave itself. You had other names on the left mentioned, like the Filipino Cardinal Tagle. You had Cardinal Aveline from France, who was among the leading candidates for the left. You had someone like Cardinal Zuppi, who perhaps, it was said he didn't have too much of a chance, but he's if they wanted to return the pontificate to Italy, he may have been seen as a leading candidate.
And I know traditionalists wanted Cardinal Erdo, Cardinal Sarah, but it looks like those candidacies never really got off the ground because their numbers were so tiny.
Yes. Well, I think they had actually, probably what happened was they wanted Erdo. He was sort of their leading candidate. I believe Cardinal Ranjit, from what I'm hearing, was seen perhaps as a compromise candidate for the more conservative wing of the college. And then Cardinal Pizzaballa was certainly in the running. I have heard quite a bit of what actually went on and how we got Prevost, how the voting went. If you'd like to,
let's get to that's called a cliffhanger, Diane. I love that you did that. Okay, let's keep the cliffhanger because I want to build to that. Contrary to the internet, though, there's a couple of storylines we need to blow up that are all over the internet.
Yes.
The heroic Cardinal Joseph Zen of Hong Kong, 94-year-old, traveled to the conclave, and it was spread about that he had come to raise his voice against Cardinal Pietro Parolin, that leading progressive candidate, the Secretary of State. Parolin was also the author of the Chinese Vatican deal that Cardinal Zen so abhors. He's watched his people destroyed by it and the faithful in China. But he didn't speak on that issue at the general congregation. Who did? Tell us who did.
Yes. Well, Cardinal Zen, first to say, why wouldn't Cardinal Zen speak about the Vatican-China deal? Why wouldn't he name Cardinal Parolin, which in what he has said publicly, he's done so much damage to the Chinese church, to the Chinese Catholics? Why? Because if that got back to the CCP, he could potentially have been imprisoned for that. And my guesses and my sources say that Cardinal Parolin also knew coming in that Cardinal Zen was not really able to speak against him. Because even though secrecy surrounds to some extent, the general congregations and certainly the conclave, the CCP could have a way to find out through perhaps this cardinal or that cardinal or even Cardinal Parolin, which if he wished to retaliate. I'm not saying that he would want to do that against Cardinal Zen, but if he did, and if he prevented him from being Pope because of it, it certainly was a possibility.
Yeah, I was told that it was Cardinal Raymond Burke in the last days of the General Congregation. It fell to him to speak out against the Vatican-China deal and Parolin's involvement there. So interesting from what was, widely reported and what actually happened.
Yes, no, certainly. And I have heard and have it on very good sources that, in fact, Cardinal Raymond Burke did speak up on the last day against Cardinal Parolin, specifically naming him by name and against the Vatican-China secret accord.
And Zen released a transcript of his address, and I mean, it mostly concerned his focus on Pope Francis's democratization of the church, the synodality model. But the new pope, interestingly enough, he mentioned synodality in those general congregations when Parolin didn't. Do you think that was deliberate?
That's a good question. It seems to me in these initial days that Pope Leo XIV, previously Cardinal Prevost, has been extremely good at unifying everyone.
Yeah.
He's speaking of Pope Francis. He's quoting him, but not quotes that would bother more traditional Catholics. He's speaking about synodality, but we have to wait to see what he means by synodality. This is a new pontificate. He's certainly a very different man in terms of his temperament, the way he's dressing, the way he's acting, the blessing we just had, and maybe you'll want to get to this, but he had an audience with journalists today. He gave a blessing in Latin to the journalists at the end, which 12 years ago Pope Francis did not do. He said to the journalists 12 years ago, because some of you are not Catholic or not believers, I'll just pray for you in my heart. Well, today Pope Leo XIV gave us all his blessing, and everyone seemed very happy about it. It was really a very good event.
No, it's a big departure. We're seeing a big shift to the middle, at least, and
Yes.
probably just back to Catholic tradition,
Yes.
to take the politics out of it. But there's another canard I need to expose, and then we're going to get to how this conclave went down.
Yeah.
There is a major story out there that Pope Leo, then Cardinal Prevost, attended a meeting at Cardinal Raymond Burke's apartment before the conclave. I have spoken to about 7 sources about this. 3 of them confirmed to me, both very close, all 3 of them very close to both sources here, parties here, who tell me that meeting never happened. One said it was an out-and-out fabrication.
Yes.
Your take on this?
No, it never happened. I have it on the best of sources that meeting never happened. There were a lot of cardinals speaking before the conclave, and the mere fact that cardinals were having meetings should not be something that bothers us, whether it's the progressives, the center, the right. That's the normal thing to do. What would we expect the cardinals to do when they haven't met for so long, except come together and meet and talk? That's perfectly natural. But this rumor going around that Cardinal Prevost had gone to Cardinal Burke's apartment and that they had spoken, it's completely false.
Yeah, that's my reportage says the same. There's also reporting that Cardinal Dolan was a kingmaker in this conclave, and he was one of the forces that elected Pope Leo. Do you believe that?
It's possible. I haven't had that confirmed. It's possible that someone like Cardinal Dolan could have spoken to the U.S. cardinals, spoken to other cardinals, say from South America, although I think the South Americans were quite united on Cardinal Prevost. He considered them. There's a very good article actually by Jason Horowitz out in the New York Times where he goes through what he has been hearing, also from cardinals who are speaking a surprising amount for just having exited what's supposed to be secret. And but
they don't fear excommunication, I guess.
I know, but well. Anyway, I've not had it confirmed that Cardinal Dolan had a major role to play.
Yeah, I want to play this for you. This is Cardinal Dolan talking to Fox 5 just after the conclave. Watch.
I think it was to his advantage that he wasn't talked about. I think it was to his advantage that he was a guy we didn't identify with any one trend or style within the College of Cardinals. I think it was to his advantage that they didn't really know he was from the United States. They didn't even know where he was from. He's sort of a citizen of the world, as we're a citizen of the world to come, not here. I think that was to his advantage. I'm thinking that a lot of my brother cardinals shared my esteem for him simply because he seemed to have come from nowhere. Remember when they said about Jesus in the gospel after his first miracle and sermon, the people said, who's this guy? Where'd he come from? We kind of like him. We want to get to know him better. That seemed to be what characterized Robert Francis Prevost, now Pope Leo.
Diane, what do you think of that? Was that the key, that they didn't know him? That he didn't seem to be American? I mean, McElroy said, the cardinal from Washington, that it was almost negligible that he was American. It didn't matter because he spent so much time in Peru. Was Prevost's invisibility here his superpower?
Raymond, there's something really interesting that just happened here in this election. There is a certain similarity between the election of Pope Francis and the election of Cardinal Prevost. Both men came out onto the loggia, and so many people said, who's that? They had no idea who the man is. Now, the two men are very, very different in character, but certainly Cardinal Prevost was someone who, yes, he would have been known to probably many bishops and some of the cardinals through his work as head of bishops here in the Roman Curia, but he was not so well known. It is said in the New York Times article, Jason Horowitz had reported that Cardinal Dolan had breakfast one morning with Prevost because he didn't know him and he wanted to get to know him. But I think the South American cardinals present in the general congregations and in the conclave knew Cardinal Prevost to be a very moderate man, to be one of theirs. So he would have certainly had the South American vote, but to be a moderate figure, which I think would have appealed to a lot of people. Also through his work in the dicastery for bishops, he was known to be someone who knew how to run a meeting, was very practical, knew how to get things done, was someone who took in other people's perspectives, listened to other people, could be decisive when he needed to be decisive. So I think all of that went in his favor.
Yeah, look, from cardinals on the traditional side, cardinals in the middle, even some cardinals on the left, I hear the same thing about this man. He's reasonable.
Yes.
He's a believer.
Yes.
He's a prayerful man.
Yes.
And he listens closely. He's not a firm ideologue, nothing set. And, we'll talk about the impact of Leo's arrival after Pope Francis at the end of the interview. But I keep hearing from cardinals that the dire finances of the Vatican were one of their big pressing concerns. How big a factor do you think that was in this election?
Well, I mean, it could have been, he does have a math background. He is known to be a very practical man. He also is from the United States. So I think if you have someone from the United States, now the question will be, what decisions will he make? What will he do? Because if he starts making decisions and doing things that really appeal to most practicing Catholics, and I think especially conservative Catholics, I think the Vatican's, it's going to find in itself in a much better financial position as a result of it. But it remains to see what he does.
I can't tell you how many people say they left the church because of the things they were hearing from the Vatican, that it disturbed them so. And and I kept saying, guys, these are side issues. This is the Pope just giving his personal opinion. It's not morality. It's not faith and doctrine. But they couldn't process it. To them, the Pope is saying it, so this is where the church must be going, and I don't want to be a part of this. So one hopes that Pope Leo can restore trust and get us to focus again on that message of salvation, the gospel. That's what this thing's about. It's supposed to be a house of salvation, not a house of ideology and political opinion. But this is Cardinal Joseph Tobin of Newark talking about knowing Cardinal Robert Prevost for 20 years when he calls Bob here. Tobin went forward to vote during the conclave, and this happened.
Then I walked back and I took a look at Bob, and because his name had been floating around, and he had his head in his hands, and I was praying for him because I couldn't imagine what happens to a human being when you're facing something like that. And then when he accepted it, it was like he was made for it. He just, all of whatever anguish was resolved by the feeling that I think that this wasn't simply his saying yes to a proposal. But God had made something clear, and he agreed with it.
Diane, what do you make of that? They talked about his manner and not anything he said, that's what sealed the deal.
Yeah, it is being reported that in the general congregations, for instance, Cardinal Prevost's speech did not stand out, which is different from the case of Cardinal Bergoglio, who would become Pope Francis. I think he really wowed people and wowed the other cardinals in the general congregations. Many cardinals don't even remember what Cardinal Prevost said, but he came across as he also we have to remember that he was chosen every 3 days during the general congregations and as part of the conclave. Several cardinals are chosen by lot to sort of run the administrative element of the conclave and the general congregations, and one of those turns was given to Cardinal Prevost. So the cardinals would have had an opportunity to see what sort of man he is, how he treats the different cardinals, how he's running things, and that may also have made an impression on them.
Mm-hmm. He was also, and I'm learning, well, first of all, he was elected twice to head the global Augustinian order.
Yes.
So, you don't get a lunatic who's elected twice, one time maybe, twice,
Yeah.
never. He was also very close to the unassuming and very holy former Chicago Cardinal, Francis George, whom I knew well. And if you look at Pope Leo at a certain vantage point, he almost reminds you of Cardinal Francis George, very unassuming, but a solid character.
Yes.
Solid character.
No, it's interesting, just since Pope Leo XIV came out onto the loggia, his appearance yesterday singing the Regina Caeli in Latin, and he has a very good voice. And I hope that continues. And his appearance today, his audience with journalists, he does have he communicates very, very well by his manner as well as by his words. He has a very unassuming nature. He's good in front of the camera, but he doesn't seem to be looking for the camera. And you really are getting a sense that he is putting Jesus first. He's putting Christ at the center rather than himself. So I think that's going to appeal to everyone.
Yeah, some of the cardinals I talked to said, they're also relying on the grace of the office, and they see the grace that Catholics believe come with the office of the Pope, that it's already transforming him in ways that maybe even he didn't expect.
Yes.
Let's talk about Pope Leo's background. He's not only the first American Pope, he's the first Creole Pope. He has roots in New Orleans, which I'm very sensitive
Congratulations.
to. Of course, the whole city's buzzing about this. His maternal grandmother was a Creole. Now, those were people who were Black and of European heritage. His grandfather was Haitian. Aside from apparently passing on some great cooking to his mother, which may have led to his vocation because priests would come over to eat her cooking. What does it say about him, and what impact do you think it'll have?
I don't know. Well, it has been reported, said through his brothers. His brothers have done quite a number of interviews, but they have stressed in some of the interviews what a Catholic family they grew up in. They said, every night after they'd be playing outside or in school all day, but every night after dinner, they prayed the rosary as a family. And so this is there were religious around the house, there were priests around the house. So he seems to have been formed in a very Catholic home, to the point which at the age 5 or 6, he already knew he wanted to be a priest.
Diane, 4,000 journalists descended on Rome for this conclave period. Most of them thought the Holy See was a body of water. So you're there every day. My question is, what don't we know about this conclave? Tell us about the inside scoop here.
So it seems what happened in the conclave, it's important to remember that Pope Leo was elected on the 4th ballot. So from what I have heard, and what seems reasonable to believe, of course, the cardinals can't, it is secretive, so the cardinals can't confirm it necessarily. But it seems as though on the first ballot on Wednesday night, it became immediately apparent that Cardinal Parolin simply didn't have enough votes to get him across the finish line, to get to the 2/3 majority. At the same time, what you had from the conservative side was Cardinal Erdo had a good number of votes, but the conservative vote was split, perhaps between Cardinal Ranjit, Cardinal Erdo, and Cardinal Pizzaballa. And at the same time already, and this would make sense if he was voted in on the 4th ballot, Cardinal Prevost already emerged as a contender on the first ballot. At the same time, the cardinals saw that Cardinal Parolin probably couldn't reach the 2/3 majority. They went back to Santa Marta that night. They spoke. In the early votes in the morning, there are 2 votes in the morning. Cardinal Prevost was gaining momentum, and the cardinals could see that by the early afternoon that he was the candidate with momentum.
Well, that's the cool thing about this process.
Yeah.
There's such variability, there's possibilities,
Yes.
and it allows the Holy Spirit room to operate rather than an up or down vote, a one-time deal. They could all come together and just take an up or down majority vote. The 2/3, it's a rolling election that allows for all sorts of unforeseen possibilities. Final question, how has this changed the atmosphere of Rome and the Vatican itself? I'm seeing reports. You have Archbishop Ganswein, the former secretary of Benedict XVI, saying it's like the air is suddenly clear again and freedom's returned.
Yes. Well, one other thing to say about the conclave itself, both I have heard this from very good sources, and I think it's being reported elsewhere, that Cardinal Prevost didn't win by a simple 2/3 majority, that the votes, we was getting into 3 digits. So the college was quite united. And I have to say, there is such a spirit of freedom. There's a spirit of unity. There is a calm that has descended upon this city that we really haven't seen in some time. So I think whoever you are, all I'm seeing is optimism that this could be a very unifying pontificate, and that we have a good pope.
Yeah, he has a serenity about him, and I think people are picking up on that. Diane Montagna, we will check in with you as this papacy matures. I thank you for your insight, your fine reportage. We'll talk soon.
Thank you, Raymond.
I spent a lot of time this week at St. Peter's Basilica, and it made me think of the mark each of these popes, these successors to St. Peter, leave on history and the church. The basilica is built upon the actual bones, the tomb of St. Peter the Apostle. There's really nothing like the expanse of St. Peter's Basilica. When you first walk in, just look at the expanse of the basilica here. It is enormous. I love when they don't have any chairs in place because it kind of underscores just how huge this basilica is. And of course, right behind me over here, Michelangelo's Pietà. And there are bees on the walls, at the base of columns, even on the ceilings. The baldacchino over the main altar would not exist were it not for this man, Maffeo Barberini, Pope Urban VIII. His papacy began in 1623. He knew Galileo well. They were close, but when Galileo refused to publish his ideas as hypotheses rather than fact, Pope Urban had him jailed. But that's another story. Part of his legacy is right in St. Peter's. He commissioned Bernini to create the baldacchino. The loggias on the front of St. Peter's, especially the one that Pope Leo just greeted the world on, that too was commissioned by Pope Urban VIII. But back to those bees. Pope Urban's family, the Barberini's crest, featured 3 bees. They were considered industrious and elegant. So whenever he added a monument or restored a part of the basilica, he made sure the Barberini bees had a place of prominence. And just so no one would forget, Pope Urban had Bernini build a monument atop his tomb in St. Peter's. Even if it took the artist 20 years to finish it, Pope Urban VIII is still there, reaching out to all of us and his many bees. For a deeper dive into who Pope Leo is, I gathered the Conclave Crew, Father Gerald Murray and Robert Royal, to discuss When We Were Still in Rome. This is a compilation of an earlier conversation. Watch. Gents, let's start with the name. I have to tell you, I was standing in the square. The Italians were not too happy with this selection. The Americans were jubilant. The Italians were a little less so. Let's start with the name. From Leo the Great, there have been 13 popes with that name, Leo. Why do you think he chose it, Father Jerry?
I think he's signaling that he wants to continue with the teaching of Pope Leo XIII, who is the father of Catholic social teaching in the modern era. And precisely because Leo XIII was a great defender of the working man, of the rights of workers to organize, to form unions, But we also have to remember that he also condemned socialism and he defended the right to private property, which in reality is also part of Catholic social teaching, despite what some social justice warriors occasionally claim. So I think this is a very important signal that he's very interested in the social teaching of the church, maintaining a presence in the, we could say, the public square as regards economic life.
Bob, any further reflections on that choice of Leo? I was surprised, actually. Another Leo.
I was too, I must say. And look, Benedict XVI chose to follow Benedict XV, who was early in the 20th century and helped to build up a sense of peace at a time of war. I get the impression that Leo XIV wants to reach back, as Father was saying, to that foundation of modern Catholic social thought in Leo XIII. In my book, A Deeper Vision, which is about the modern Catholic intellectual tradition, I have a great, an intricate and careful analysis of what Leo did. And one of the things that Leo did was he also created the resurgence of studies of St. Thomas Aquinas, and he linked the two. So much so that my friend Russell Hittinger, who's an expert on natural law and modern Catholic social thought, has pointed out that Leo never talked about social thought without mentioning St. Thomas. Now, I don't know that Leo XIV has exactly got that in mind, but I would hope that he would not just accept the framework of modern politics and economics, but would actually be reaching deeply into our Catholic tradition of thinking about society and bring something new and dynamic and creative to a circumstance that is very, very troubling in many ways.
Father, what did you make of the mozzetta that he was wearing, that red cape that is traditional for the Pope to wear? I mean, we did not see that from Pope Francis. I mean, though he is considered, Leo XIV is considered to be in the vein of Pope Francis, and we'll get into that in a moment, but contrast that image with that of Pope Francis the first time we saw him.
Yes, Pope Leo made the conscious choice to observe the traditional practice that popes come out, they're wearing the white cassock for the first time, but then they're wearing the mozzetta, which is red, which is the symbol of a bishop. They're wearing, the Pope wears then the red stole, symbolizing martyrdom. And then there are two martyrs pictured on that, Peter and Paul, who are the two founders, we say, of the church in Rome. And then he, of course, then followed the ritual very carefully, because there's a ritual with some prayers which go back, to the old Mass. Even those prayers, I was listening to them. He has, by the way, his Latin is very good. He said the words beautifully. He had written out his comments in Italian, which probably reflects the fact that he doesn't think spontaneously in Italian, so he wanted to have them written. But they were good remarks. So I was impressed. He was sending a signal of continuity with previous popes. Pope Francis, basically, we learned from sources that he viewed that as too much of a spectacle, and he didn't want to participate in it. But in a way, you could say that Pope Leo was subsuming his personality right into the office and was stepping away from making, how can we say, statements that indicate personal preferences.
He did say in his first address, and I remember, I couldn't make it all out because, as we've been commenting, it was very hard to hear in St. Peter's Square or above it. He did say we need to be a synodal church and reach out in dialogue and encounter. What does that mean, Robert Royal?
Well, look, it can mean any number of things because, as we've said over and over again, synodality itself is kind of an empty sack that could be either filled or not filled, depending on who the Pope happens to be. Yeah, he really did emphasize the continuity with Francis quite a bit. But as Father rightly says, not only in the way that he vested himself or was vested for the event yesterday, but the way he carries himself. He conveys, I've spoken to a number of people back home in America as well as here in Rome, and the way he conducts himself is as a serious man, a mature man who's careful about what he says and brings a kind of a I think he brings back a little bit of the majesty already of what the Pope is like, even though he's an American and we're not supposed to have, sort of that kind of mentality in us. It'll be interesting to see where that goes, because you can be in continuity with the previous Pope and yet at the same time practice a certain innovation. And the very fact that he chose that name, that jumped back a century and more to the name of Leo, it'll be interesting to see where he goes. And I don't think we can predict.
Father, I thought of you when I heard that. We were standing on the balcony together. You were doing a hit, and I was right there. And I thought, my gosh, how much time have we spent trying to determine what the term synodality means? And here's the Pope saying, we need a synodal church. I've been waiting for this. What is your take on that? And what do you think he intends?
Well, I think he's signaling to the cardinals and others, particularly the cardinals who voted for him, that he is going to not stop this synodal process that Pope Francis began, because it's quite clear those who criticize the synodal path were hoping to elect a pope who would put an end to it. That certainly was my hope, because synodality is a vague concept, and it really is a change from what it originally meant. Synodality is based on the word synod. Synod in the modern sense was created by Paul VI after Vatican II to have a forum in which bishops throughout the world would meet periodically to advise the Pope on the needs of the church in the modern world. Pope Francis turned it into a meeting of laity, priests, deacons, nuns, and bishops, and gave everybody an equal vote. And this was indicative, it's kind of like it was a stage post or, a way station on the way to what they're going to have in 2028, which is the ecclesial assembly, in which bishops will not be the majority in Rome. And I wrote a column at the Catholic thing tearing into it, which it deserves to be. We are not a church in which the hierarchy is an appendage. It's a hierarchical church with synodal experiences. It's not a synodal church with hierarchical appendages. That's what I'm very much afraid of. So it's not clear what Pope Leo means by synodal church, but if it means the ecclesial assembly in 2028, well, get ready, because there's going to be a lot of opposition based on the fact that this is completely at odds with the hierarchical nature of the Catholic Church.
Well, it's also at odds with the founding of the church. The Lord didn't bring all the disciples and everybody following him through Galilee and say, hey guys, you all have the power to loose and bind. Whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven, and loosed on earth is loosed in heaven. No, he gave that only to Peter and then to the apostles. It's a very limited group. So it does kind of corrupt the vision of church governance when you start bringing atheists in and non-believers in, everybody and their dog in, and then and only a select group of cardinals who agree with you. That's a problem. Bob, I'll give you the last word on this.
Yeah, I think that the next stage to look toward, because the Father's right, that 2028 is, if that's going to continue on the way it was originally planned, that's going to be a big problem.
Which
but
Pope
we know
Francis
that
approved from the Gemelli Clinic, from his hospital bed.
But we know that in June, those 10 study groups that were established at the end of the last synod in October, that basically took the hot button issues off the table, women deacons, all that sort of stuff. Their reports are due in June. So presumably those committees have been working on this all this time, in spite of the fact that Francis was ill. They're supposed to deliver reports in June. If they do that and they are submitted to Pope Leo, we can see how he reacts to that, what he's going to do with them. Does he immediately kind of publish them, or does he say, well, let me think this over a bit? That'll be our first indication, I think our first solid indication of what he intends to do.
Look, we always said, and I was told by cardinals, including many of whom we had meetings and dinners and encounters with over the last 10 days or so, that an American could not be named Pope. America's already powerful enough. You don't need an American Pope. Yet, Pope Leo is the first American in history. Why do you think they elected him, Father? I'm told in part because of the financial straits of the Vatican. A $2 billion deficit, $400 million in unpaid pensions. Father, why an American?
Well, I think that's one of the two important reasons. Well, there are a number of reasons, but I'll give two that I think are important. One is precisely this. They understand that someone coming from what we call the Anglosphere, in other words, the Anglo-Saxon world, English-speaking world, that financial competence and rigor are normal in the operations of the economies of England, Australia, Canada, and the United States. And therefore, there's hope that he will bring that kind of vision to the reform here, because we're talking $2 billion pension hole. We're talking major operating deficits every year. We're talking mismanagement of assets. So hopefully Pope Leo will bring in some very serious and powerful minds and voices to say, no, we're going to top to bottom renewal. Secondly, he really is a Latin American in experience because his priesthood was lived in Peru at the beginning, and then at the end when he was a bishop in Chiclayo. His Spanish is perfect. So he is, by experience, he's really a Latin American, but he's also a North American. So he's both Americans. I think that was attractive. Other reasons, of course, has to do with the fact that he was appointed to this important position at the Dicastery of Bishops by Pope Francis and made a cardinal by him. So the continuity with Pope Francis is assumed by those who voted for him, because they would say he wouldn't be here to be elected Pope if it weren't for Pope Francis. Those are some of the things I think are going on.
Bob, how do you think this will impact having an American Pope, Pope Leo? How will that impact his relationship with America, which we have to say has been tense since Trump came to town?
Yeah. Look, I hear some people saying, and this is part of that over-speculation that takes place at a moment like this. I hear some people saying that the cardinals chose him to confront Trump.
Yeah,
I think this is utter nonsense, because what they're primarily concerned about are some of the issues we just mentioned that are really pressing on the church at this moment. In fact, it might actually help that he knows the United States pretty well. I was a little bit disappointed that he didn't use any English during his initial address last evening, because look, he is very much a Latin American now. He's very much a Roman. He's spent a number of years now in Rome. But darn it, you are who you are. I mean, if you started on the south side of Chicago, I think you ought to be proud of that. And it's, we are all sensitive to the cultural issues like synodality, homosexuality, women priests, all that sort of thing. Yeah. But I think he's shown himself to be a safe pair of hands. And as I said earlier, he's impressed a number of people. He's even impressed me. I mean, I'm just seeing him on TV. But the emotion that he showed last night and the kind of maturity that he seems to radiate, I think if you were looking around and saying, look, we need to clean house here in Rome and calm down a bit and take some of those practical steps that we know we need to take, but we don't seem to have been able to do, you could be worse. And on top of it, he knows a lot of these bishops who've been appointed because he was the head man in that office. So there are a number of things that come together that could be helpful. He probably isn't going to look that American to most Americans back in North America, but he is an American. Yeah, and I won't rub it in I won't rub it in that I predicted yesterday that it is not impossible.
Well, we have the video evidence, unfortunately, or I would deprive you of that, but I can't. And look, in his first Mass at the Sistine Chapel, the Pope used the crozier of Pope Benedict. So it's being reported. Others say that crozier is actually Paul VI. I don't know who's right here. But does that have any meaning, Father?
Yes, and he also began the sermon in English. He did off-the-cuff remarks in English, because I think somebody told him, the Americans are waiting for you to talk in English at the balcony, which he didn't do. Yeah, I mean, he's stressing continuity and with not just Pope Francis, but Pope Benedict and even John Paul. He had quoted John Paul, and let's just say this, the sermon was a very serious sermon in which he talked about practical atheism, talked about challenges in the modern world that the church faces. He talked about the necessity of preaching the gospel to the world, Christocentric, we would say, centered on Christ. So I was impressed with the sermon, and I think the cardinals listening were too.
Yeah, look, anytime you mention Ignatius of Antioch and giving yourself, for the faith, that's pretty good stuff. I want to give the audience a little taste. This is the opening of his homily, which he pronounced in English. Watch.
I begin with a word in English, and the rest is in Italian. But I want to repeat the words from the responsorial psalm. I will sing a new song to the Lord because he has done marvels. And indeed, not just with me, but with all of us, my brother cardinals, as we celebrate this morning, I invite you to recognize the marvels that the Lord has done, the blessings that the Lord continues to pour out upon all of us. Through the ministry of Peter, you have called me to carry that cross and to be blessed with that mission. And I know I can rely on each and every one of you to walk with me as we continue as a church, as a community of friends of Jesus, as believers, to announce the good news, to announce the gospel.
Bob, what do you make of that?
Well, it's nice. And we had a pope. A priest pointed out to me a little while ago that Pope Francis was really the only modern pope in the 20th century and on who didn't speak English. And that doubtless tilted his understanding of the world somewhat. And I think we have to expect that Pope Leo is also, because he's largely now a Latin American and his mentality is going to be absorbed somewhat into that view. But if he's very serious about presenting the gospel to the world, and he's serious about how the church is going to form the world at this moment of transition that we seem to be in a variety of ways. We're going to have to bring in some new energies. And I think some of those energies are going to have to come from English-speaking sources, because we're the place where, the modern world has actually succeeded, at least economically, more or less politically. We have all kinds of crises in the English-speaking world. But for him to step out with that, I think is going to expand the mentality a little bit, because what language you use makes a difference.
Yeah, well, and our confrere, Father Murray, said yesterday on the podcast that this should be the basic and foundational language used at the Vatican, that it should be English. Maybe he's listening to the podcast, Father.
Well, in a global world, you want to imitate the UN, start using English. I mean, yeah, it's, I've thought this for a long time. English is the language. I mean, airplane pilots have to know English. It's a practicality that things get done easily when people can understand each other. So yeah, that would be a basic step. Italian is a minor language in the overall world picture. It's important because it's the language of the Holy See.
We had a few comments. Some were saying, Father Murray's saying we should replace the Latin with English. No. He's saying the language used to converse in Vatican offices and in the Vatican city-state, right now it's Italian, it's not Latin.
Yeah, no, and let me note this. He's a canon lawyer, the new pope, and I'm a canon lawyer, so I like that. But I like it for other reasons, but one of which is the law is written in Latin, because that is a whole history up to this point. And then with all the different translations, it's good to have a reference point. So canon law should stay in Latin. But yeah, I mean, office memos in English would be very practical.
Father, Pope Leo has asked all the curial heads, that means all the men who run, and women in some cases, these various dicasteries in the Vatican offices, he's asked them to stay in their positions for the time being, to keep their respective jobs until further notice. What does that tell you?
Yeah, that's a standard practice when the new pope comes in, and it's a wise practice because, when the offices reopen after this, momentous time of the pope's death and burial and now the election of the new pope, there's a lot of work that has to be done. And if the leader is not there at each of these departments, it becomes a little bit difficult. But the tell, as they would say, is going to be who does he replace and who does he keep in place? Because, the heads of these dicasteries were very much disciples of Pope Francis and often proponents of implementing radical ideas at a accelerated pace even. So we'll get a read on Pope Leo's continuity program by seeing who's left and who's replaced.
Bob, Pope Leo spent a lot of time in Peru. How does that experience, that missionary experience, shape this pontificate? I mean, you heard it in his opening comment when he was on the loggia the other day. Basically, that the pastors should smell of the sheep and they have to walk with the people.
Yeah, Peru has been a very troubled place. Most English speakers in North America don't know much about Peru, but Peru went through a terrible period toward the end of the 20th century with a movement called Sendero Luminoso, which was a Marxist import from China. It just ripped up the whole society. They began to reform, and in recent decades too, they've had a number of political ups and downs, let's put it that way. So he's confronted in Chiclayo is a relatively small diocese. I have a personal connection with it because a priest that I grew up with in my little parish in Connecticut was sent as a missionary down there. He was supposed to be there for
Wow.
2 years, and he loved it, and he just stayed the whole time. And we all kind of felt close to it in where I grew up. But look, he's seen that. I think he was the vice president of the Bishops' Conference there, and so he's seen the turmoil of Latin America, and in a way, that political turmoil maybe is something that he's thinking about when he takes the name Leo XIV. But I would also say that there is a evangelizing turmoil that we know that the Pentecostals and the other sort of evangelical groups are growing by leaps and bounds in these places. And so you can lament that that's happening, but you have to do something. And in many of the places in Latin America that I'm familiar with, the reason why people leave the church is precisely because they want to get away from politics. That
Right.
the church is too politicized, either for liberation theology or something or other. That's going to be a tough needle for him to thread, and it'll be interesting to keep an eye on what he does with that.
Well, that's a great intro to what we talked about the other day, which is really the challenges facing the church right now in the post-Francis era, if you will, and then now in the beginning of the Leo era. So I want to talk about how well Pope Leo might be disposed, or perhaps not, to embrace some of these challenges. In an earlier episode, we talked about the collapse of due process, Father, in the church, canonical norms under Pope Francis. They were just shattered. As you mentioned a moment ago, Robert Prevost, now Pope Leo, is a canon lawyer. Tell me, restate some of the problems that, in your mind, need addressing, and how he may approach these canonical issues, and how culpable he may be in a way that Pope Francis perhaps was not.
Well, as a canon lawyer, he knows the rules. He knows why the rules are put in place. In other words, they're not arbitrary things invented just to keep the powerful powerful. Canon law is designed to guarantee respect for the rights of everyone in the church. So the hierarchs have to follow procedures when there are questions regarding people subject to them. There are a lot of issues remaining that need to be looked at. We have sex abuse enforcement. I mean, right now we have Bishop Zanchetta, who was announced to be under a canonical process over 3 or 4 years ago. I can't remember how long, but we've never heard another word about it.
No.
So that process has to be brought to completion, because guess what? This man was convicted in a civil court in Argentina of abusing seminarians. There's no reason why this man, if guilty, found guilty in canonical process, should not be removed from the priesthood. Same with Father Marco Rupnik. He was thrown out of the Jesuits because he wouldn't cooperate with them in their investigation of sexual abuse of nuns who were under his spiritual care. So sex abuse is going to be something very important to look at. Similarly, we have to look at how investigations are done of religious orders, because Pope Francis had a hostility, and this is noted, I'm not inventing this, to more traditional and charismatic type groups in the church. Some of them had problems, there's no doubt. The Sodalizio in Peru was the founder of it, was found guilty of sex abuse, and others in the group participated. But Pope Francis abolished the group, and a lot of good members felt that there was not enough due process. The Institute of the Incarnate Word is currently under investigation. Now, its founder in Argentina was also found guilty of sexual abuse of minors or seminarians. But that group is worldwide. In fact, the Pope always called the parish in Gaza, every night, and the pastor there is a member of that group. So there are a lot of groups in France have similar investigations going on. We never heard the end about the Franciscans of the Immaculate in Italy and elsewhere. They were put under a moderator, and no resolution was. So there are going to be those canonical investigations that need to be completed. Opus Dei, they changed the law regarding personal prelators. It's a complicated canonical thing, won't go into, but Opus Dei was given the opportunity to submit their own revised statutes. And they were at a meeting when the Pope died in which they were going to come up with their final proposal. So they suspended the statute proposal. The new Pope's going to have to take that up. So those are some of the things. These are canonical issues. And the reason they're important is everybody else is watching. And if these groups feel they were treated unfairly, and everyone else is going to be suspicious. If fairness is evident, that's how you have social harmony in the church.
Yeah. Let's get into some of the other areas the Pope will be contending with. The Pope Leo, when he was Cardinal Robert Prevost, is being quoted in the media as saying this in a 2012 address: Catholic pastors who preach against legalization of abortion or the redefinition of marriage are portrayed as being ideologically driven, severe, and uncaring. He went on to call out the media for depicting the, quote, homosexual lifestyle and same-sex partners with their adopted children as a challenge. Your thoughts, Bob, on these quotes and the upsetment that some gay groups are communicating today? They say, wait, this is a departure from Pope Francis. He was welcoming us, and these comments are just abrasive and hostile.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I mean, that's actually, though, 13 years ago. And the question is right now. Pope Francis said a lot of strong things about pro-life, about protecting life in the womb and protecting life at the end of natural life. But he didn't do much. And I would like to see some more action and even drum beating. Francis actually discouraged people from being obsessed and focused on the pro-life issues and the gay issues. And I think that was to his detriment, because he just kind of in advance announced, yeah, we're going to say this, but we're not going to do anything. As far as the gay thing goes, in addition to what Father was just saying about the high-handedness that Francis often showed toward these other groups, I would hope that in addition to following the law, that Leo would look deeply into why it is that it's been so difficult to move the needle within the church on homosexuality. And clearly, there is some kind of protective network that exists. It was also personal when it came to Francis with the cases of Zanchetta, and it appears also with Rupnik to some degree. But we know that there's some kind of protective network here that needs to be rooted out. It simply can't go on that at a time when, as we're learning, that the young priests who are coming into the church in the United States and elsewhere are deeply, deeply satisfied being heterosexual. Homosexuals are tending not to go into the seminary. That the church, in terms of its general culture, is kind of turned. There can't any longer be this network that has protected the McCarricks and the Zanchettas and on and on and on. And he's going to have to look very carefully into this. John Paul wasn't able to do it, and we know he would like to have done it. Mm-hmm. Benedict was not able to do it, and we know he would like to have done it. Francis talked about it. He issued some documents, but we're still not very far from where we were when he became Pope. So this is a burning issue. Life and redefining sexuality in the family in a way that makes sense and stands strong against the activism of these homosexual groups.
Father, I want to invite you into this. I know you're probably champing at the bit. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, Bob's got a very good point. And this goes back to what, remember Bishop Morlino, who made a speech to the U.S. bishops and says, we have to confront the fact that there's a homosexual problem in the clergy, and this cannot be tolerated. So what it basically means is the Vatican has to make it clear. Priests who are unchaste, meaning they don't live, Christian teaching about sexual purity, they're unchaste, they are a blot on the priesthood. They have to reform their lives or be removed, because you can't have a system in which people are expected to teach a series of propositions that the church considers to be the truth, and yet they reject them in their own lives, and I'm sure in private tell people, don't pay attention to this stuff. So that's a problem. And then the more general issue is it the role of a bishop as a shepherd to protect the flock in ways that are going to upset some people? And it always is. We're not here to please governments. We're not here to please corporations. We're not here to please the homosexual lobby, which says it's unfair that the Catholic Church stigmatizes what we do. Well, the answer is, you can go where you want as a person. We hope you'll embrace Catholicism, but don't try to subvert Catholic teaching in the name of Christ, saying, well, Jesus was never severe. What do you mean he wasn't severe? Jesus is the author of the Bible, which says that homosexual activity is an abomination. So we have to get to that point, Raymond.
Cardinal Prevost, now Pope Leo, was head of the dicastery of bishops that selected and dispatched, we have to just say it, many bishops, notably Bishop Strickland in the United States, in Tyler, Texas, Bishop Ray in France. Both were removed. One for saying things on social media that was overboard about Pope Francis. One for being too orthodox and having really thriving seminarians in the diocese, but they were too traditional for the Vatican's taste. I read one story where Provost ran the visitation that looked into Bishop Ray. Your thoughts on what this tells us, and do you think it might restore, or he might restore, those bishops back to practice? Bob?
Well, about Strickland, I'm doubtful, although I don't have any insight into that. That, I think, was kind of a personal clash that Bishop Strickland had over what he thought that Francis was doing, and often his arguments were well taken. This question in France bothers me a bit more because when someone is described as being too orthodox and they have too many seminarians coming in and the diocese is flourishing, it just seems to me to be normal human reaction to look at it and say, hey, why is this working?
Too many people want salvation. Too many people want to serve Jesus. What's happening?
People are showing up and they want to be priests. Well, why is there anything wrong with that? And if they're going overboard, and maybe they are, maybe there's a kind of a spirit of rebellion that can even take place in these traditional places. Well, you don't abolish it, though. What you try to do is you try to work with them. And we hear a lot that Cardinal Prevost was a listener, that he would listen and proceed in a kind of a calm and mature way to make decisions. So I'm a little worried about that, of course, because it just seems to me inexplicable. It could be that somebody put pressure on him. Certainly in the case of the appointment of McElroy in Washington, D.C., we have to think that was the hand of the Pope, specifically reaching in there and saying, I want him, move him from San Diego to Washington, D.C. So some of these decisions may not be entirely his, but he's going to have to take on the responsibilities now. If we don't want a church that is just going to continue to collapse, and it'll have a large number of faithful people, but it'll continue to collapse. Its influence will continue to collapse. The evangelization, the carrying out of the message of Jesus to the world begins to be weaker and weaker. If we don't want that, then we need to take some new directions. And it's not the ones that we've had the past 12 years. There was no Francis effect.
Father, do you want to add anything there quickly?
Well, so yes, I think it's incumbent on the Pope to restore or to give an assignment to bishops who are removed in ways I consider unjust. Bishop Daniel Fernandez in Puerto Rico has no assignment. He should be made a bishop of a diocese or an auxiliary bishop. Same with Strickland. And Bishop Ray, he was mistreated, and he should also be given an assignment because the Pope basically removed them from their diocese as a form of punishment, but he didn't suspend them. So they still fully function as priests and Mass and confession. This is an anomalous situation. It shouldn't happen.
Okay, we talked about the sex abuse crisis a little earlier and how Pope Francis shielded friends and colleagues at times from justice, ignoring the cries of victims, it has to be said. Pope Leo has his own record in Peru and Chicago that has gotten some coverage since yesterday. A number of girls in Peru claimed a priest abused them. They went to Prevost, and they claim no investigation was ever opened. What will Pope Leo's approach be, do you think, to restore confidence and transparency in the church? What is required now, Father, briefly?
Well, this case in Peru, I read, from the point of view of the complaining people, meaning the people feel offended by what Cardinal Prevost, how he handled the matter. I think it would be good if we got an explanation of that. The Peruvian bishops issued a statement a while ago saying that he did everything right. The canon lawyer for the 3 girls who say they're abused by 2 priests say he didn't. So I think we need enlightenment on that. There's also the case in Chicago where, as head of the Augustinian order, he assigned a priest to live who'd been accused by multiple accusations of sexual abuse of minors. He was put into a rectory, which was located in close proximity to a Catholic grammar school, and that this was in fact something that Cardinal Suppick had apologized for previously doing a similar assignment. So those things should be dealt with. And, the Pope, if he says, I regret decisions I made and I apologize to the victim, it'll be over. I mean, that's just the way you clear things up.
Well, as you said the other day, just let a due process trial and investigation proceed, and then show no favoritism to anyone. Everyone is under the same law. That would restore, I think, confidence if we just did that. Over and under, before we go, will he live in the Apostolic Palace, Bob?
Yes.
Yes? Oh,
yes, okay. I think that what we saw by the way he presented himself and whatnot, and remember, Francis didn't go to Santa Marta because it's uncomfortable or it's humble. He just didn't want to be isolated. And I think it's a much better place for the Pope to be, and he probably understands that as well.
Yeah. Father?
Agreed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And let's face it, it's more humble dwellings than the Santa Marta. I've been to both, I can tell you. Yeah. One's like the Hilton, the other is like a little hostel. The Apostolic Palace is not the hallways are grand, but the room, it's a tiny room. Yeah, I mean, it's not much, and it's drafty in the winter. One last caveat. This is not a president or a prime minister. This is the 267th successor of St. Peter the Apostle, the Prince of the Apostles. And there is grace that comes with that office, and that's getting lost in a lot of these conversations I'm seeing in the media. It has power to not only remake the church, but the man who holds that office. We will watch the rise of Pope Leo XIV together and pray that God guides him and shapes him in these days to come. I hope you'll come back to Arroyo Grande soon. And the posse, I think we'll keep rolling on. What do you think? Drop a comment below. And make sure you subscribe to the Arroyo Grande podcast on our YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts, and like us. Why live a dry, narrow trickle of a life when if you fill it with good things, it can flow into a broad, thriving Arroyo Grande? I'm Raymond Arroyo. We'll see you next time. Thanks for diving in. Bye now. Arroyo Grande is produced in partnership with iHeart Podcasts and is available on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you get your podcasts.